Hey folks, welcome to Voices from L5. We have a really great episode for you guys today with PJ Blount, the adjunct professor at the University of Mississippi School of Law. He's also on the board of directors for the International Space Law Institute. I'm going to level with you guys. We lost the intro to this one. I'm not really sure what happened, but the usual spiel where I say, hi, welcome to Voices from L5. Today with me we have X. That's gone somewhere. But we have pretty much the entire of the episode other than that, so I'm just going to sneak it in here. You guys probably won't even notice. Anyway, check it out. It's a good one. Bye.
The act of moving onward means we pass these signposts. One of them was first leaving Earth. The next one is hanging out on the moon. What's next? The planets. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world. This fragile little world. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world.
So the Tamil Tigers are a great example of a group that's used a satellite that they shouldn't have been using, and this happens occasionally. And they were using, they were bouncing messages through an Intelsat transponder that they were able to hack into and use in order to organize their own communications. We also see this in the Amazon River basin, where the river in the jungle makes communication up and down the basin difficult. So what a lot of these people have done is they've gotten little satellite dishes, they've gotten laptop computers, and they figured out how to bounce communications upriver off satellites. And there are other examples of these. So satellites have become increasingly vulnerable to the same sorts of hacking that we see happening, all around us. The Target hack, the Home Depot hack, and Stuxnet in particular. And I think Stuxnet, as a military grade virus is a great example of the risks for space here. One of the reasons why Stuxnet was so shocking is that the types of computers that it was attacking weren't the usual types. Nobody saw a commercial reason for hacking into these computers, and so nobody was concerned about the security for them, because there were these control boxes that we see in factories, and very sort of esoteric, I guess, type of computer. And satellites, to the same extent, have a lot of that same sort of thought going around them, right? Cybercrime isn't interested in hacking into satellites, but other states are. And as the ability to create cyber weapons grows, satellites are going to be at a lot of risk. And satellites as strategic assets need to be very, very concerned about this. And so it's I think one of those things that law and policy needs to begin to think about. How do we secure satellites from cyber attacks? How do we go about making sure communications are encrypted and unbreakable to adversaries? And so I think that sort of dynamic is one that we're going to see playing out in space. And I think it's the next big sort of space security challenge is making sure not that our satellites are safe from kinetic ASATs, but that our satellites are safe from non-kinetic ASATs.
I mean, a lot of that mirrors what's going on just in the world today in general. I mean, a lot of people are waking up to the fact that cybersecurity is, on the same level in a lot of ways as physical security, and the damage that can be done, while not physical and not, traditionally, what would you call it, bodily harm, comes from cyber hacking. A lot of financial and economic damage can come from cyber attacks, and I think that it's basically just being mirrored in space, right? Like, as not just let's say the good side of things, the people who are trying to harden these devices and people who are on the receiving end of these attacks are seeing the damage that these attacks can bring, but also the people who are interested in these cyber attacks and the people who stand to benefit from these attacks are seeing the capabilities of cyber warfare. We're going to see a lot more, adversaries, if you like, arising from that, and a lot more targets are going to start opening up, like satellites.
Oh yeah, I mean, satellites are sort of almost a no-brainer to be targets here. If you think back to the Rumsfeld report from 2001, and this was a report done in the United States on space security, and it was interestingly enough, it was in January of 2001, so it predated 9/11. And that was the first time we saw this phrase, the Pearl Harbor in space, and it was this idea that we've been treating space as a high ground. But really what we've got is a bunch of sitting ducks up there, because it's not that difficult to figure out where something is in space and where it's going to be when it comes around the next time.
Mm.
And so this idea that the ultimate high ground no longer had that continues to crumble as we see that because an ASAT in the kinetic sense, like the one that China used against FY1C. And then the follow up that from the United States against USA 193. These are actually really sophisticated surface to air missiles. This isn't something that just any old group does. Cyber, on the other hand, is something that any old group does, and it's not the economic boundaries for gaining access to an attack like that are much lower.
And it's
And
like you
from
said, it's a dish satellite and a laptop, and you're pretty much there.
Yeah, and if you can code, you're on your way. And the other, component to this is that if you're thinking about the security stance of other spacefaring nations that may or may not be rivals, so if we think of the United States and Russia and China, and then Europe, primarily, I think France has a lot of military sats up there. These countries are interested in not creating more space debris. And so kinetic is being downplayed as a form of attack. And cyber and other attacks that are non-kinetic, like dazzling or spoofing or jamming, are becoming more and more sort of in vogue because there is a recognition that you can destroy your own strategic environment by polluting it with space debris, and so that makes cyber a bit more, I guess, palatable.
I wonder if, I mean, you could see an intersection between those two elements of attack, though. If, say, a terrorist organization or some sort of rogue group decided that they wanted to conduct a kinetic attack, I wonder how difficult it would be to find a satellite that had maneuvering capability and just put it in the path of some other satellite.
That's certainly the flow down from that. Yes, is
Hmm.
that if you can take control of a satellite, then you can turn it into a kinetic weapon. And if they've gained full control via a hack, I don't think it would be that difficult. Now, that would there is one bit to this. They would have to either um, be able to do this attack while that satellite's on the horizon, or they'd have to be able to inject code that would be able to control the satellite after it left their horizon, right? Because otherwise, you're going to need a lot of ground stations. But let's say it was a geostationary satellite, that thing stays on the horizon all the time, and so feasibly, you could just move it over in the geostationary arc and take out something else.
Cause a lot of havoc that way.
Oh yeah, and the geo orbit is not one that we necessarily want degraded with debris because it's sort of the most valuable one for global communications.
Sure, sure. So let's move on to what exactly is being done then. I mean, what is from your point of view? I mean, obviously, you're not, I presume anyway, and if I suppose if you were, you probably couldn't let us all know. But I presume you're not in any secret government organizations that deal with high level, satellite security and
I'm
military
completely unclassified.
encryption. But what seems to be happening to help us secure these satellites? I mean, what's the answer there?
Well, I think that the satellite portion is a smaller part of a larger military debate that's going on right now, and it's one that I think, in the past 10 years, we have begun to really have to take seriously. And it's, I think, I want to say it was 2008 or 2009. It may have been a little later, a little earlier. We had this quote from it was in the Washington Post, and it was a top U.S. defense official, unnamed, obviously. And he said, if you blow up our power grid, we may put a missile down your smokestack. And it was this first acknowledgement that a cyber attack on critical infrastructure might be responded to with physical force. And that's how the US military and a lot of militaries right now are looking at this and how are we going to protect critical infrastructure. But the other interesting layer of this is with a lot of militaries and the US Air Force in particular is that the Air Force has traditionally been the service branch that has managed space assets. Well, now they're also the branch that manages cybersecurity assets, and we're seeing that there is this increasing association between space and cyber,
Mm.
and I think that a lot of that is going to turn out into standards, protocol standards, cybersecurity standards, for satellites as well as other specific types of infrastructure. And so, right now, we don't see a ton of actual policy documents in that are specific to cybersecurity in space. But I think that you have to read space within the larger cybersecurity context, and so it's being pulled into all the cybersecurity talk that you see coming out of militaries right now.
Sure, sure, sure. I mean, in many ways, they are literally just another thing in the Internet of Things, like you said earlier in the episode. I mean, is that an attitude that we are seeing coming around? I mean, I know that at least in the early days of the internet, cybersecurity was kind of seen as something that dumb kids would do. Like cyber attacks were just sort of kids fooling around and wasn't taken massively seriously for a long time. And I mean, now that, countries and nations have been getting more and more into it the past 10 years or so, obviously that's changing. But are we seeing that reflected in things like policy?
I think that it will be. If you look at cybersecurity documents that have come out of the Obama administration, for instance, they very much are concerned with this idea of protecting critical infrastructure and viewing telecommunications as part of the critical infrastructure of how the nation works. And
Mm.
so we're seeing it pulled in that way. Whether satellites are beginning to be viewed this way, I think it's a slower process. And I'll go back to the Stuxnet example because I think it's a really interesting one to kind of play against the satellite regime that we have going here. And in Stuxnet, right, we have a program that's been designed to attack nuclear centrifuges, refinement centrifuges in a plant in Iran. It's made by the United States, and it was very specifically against control boxes. They're computers that sit in factories, and what they do is they control machines. And up until Stuxnet, there were very, very, very few people taking the security of these machines seriously.
Mm.
And then Stuxnet happens, and kind of everybody shits their pants, and it's like, oh God, we got to fix this. And I think that particular incident was one that's making, companies that are making these computers think a lot more about security and about the flow down effects of when you connect something to the internet.
It's a wake up call.
Go ahead.
It's a wake up call.
It is, and I think that space has probably seen that. At the same time, we haven't had the same sort of debilitating attack, and so I think that one of the big questions is to what extent are satellite operators beginning to take this threat seriously, and to what extent are they coming up with ways to mitigate this. And I do know that there's some work on early protocols and early standards for cybersecurity on satellites. But as of right now, I haven't seen anything extraordinarily substantive come out.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that in the next 5 to 10 years, that satellite operators will have either woken up and they'll be thinking about this, or something bad will have happened that makes them wake up and think about this. And as you see legacy systems actually go out of service and new systems get launched and put in place, I think newer systems are going to probably handle this stuff a lot better.
What can you tell us about what security currently exists on these satellites? I mean, I'm by no means a cybersecurity expert or anything, but I've done a little bit of reading, and I'm interested in, encryption and security and other aspects. And it strikes me that something as simple as a, salt and hash handshake protocol sort of thing going on would mitigate a great deal of potential for cyber attacks on satellites. But what do we currently have on them?
To be real honest, I can't speak specifically to
Sure.
what's on any given satellite. I do know that satellite operators do have encrypted uplink and downlink,
Hmm.
specifically for, the communications that are telling the satellite what to do and what not to do. And so there are definitely protocols and encryption protocols and communication standards that are being used to mitigate this.
Hmm.
At the same time, I think the big question out there is what is the strength of these,
Right.
and how reliable are they, and to what extent, are commercial actors putting them in place? Because you've got, the military is definitely, they're protecting their satellites. They're going to be on networks that are military only networks. It's a much higher burden to hack into one of those. But let's say you've got, a commercial remote sensing satellite in low Earth orbit.
Or
Um,
heck, even one of those the micro satellites that people are building in their bedrooms now.
exactly, exactly. If and these are the ones that we have questions about. And maybe the nanosats don't pose as much threat because most of them don't have maneuverability. But if they begin to have maneuverability, as we begin to make things smaller and
Right.
smaller and smaller.
I was going to say,
um,
I guarantee that's coming pretty
Yeah,
soon.
yeah. I mean, you think about nano satellites in low Earth orbit. It's just like bowling balls,
Hmm.
rolling around. And so, no, I mean, I think that those are a lot of the questions that need to be asked. And I would say, from a legal perspective, I don't know. I would have to go and dig through the regs to be sure. So this isn't a 100% statement, but it's an 80% statement. I'm pretty sure that this isn't addressed in our licensing regime, right?
Mm.
Because the FAA is worried about safety. And so the security of your communications isn't really their wheelhouse.
And
Um,
primarily the things that the FAA are dealing with are things like safety to planes and what have you. Like when you're launching something from Earth, a lot of the things that you're dealing with are airspace violations rather than, you know,
it, it,
space issues.
well, exactly. Well, the FAA, Office of Commercial Space Transportation. They like the main concern, yes, is let's not hit a plane. But the FAA actually licenses all launches and makes sure that they are done in a safe manner, including planes, including the surrounding area, making sure that beaches are closed, so in
Hmm.
case it goes down poorly.
Right.
But they're just not, the cybersecurity thing isn't something that I think they're thinking about in the licensing procedure. The FCC might have some of it, but really their concern is that you're just not stepping out of your bandwidth, right? Whether or not you have encrypted your uplink and downlink might not be something the FCC is really concerned with, and NOAA is really only concerned with the images that you're taking of the Earth. And so I think that moving forward, there is going to be a need to address cybersecurity within some sort of licensing regime. And my hope would be that in the commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act, the new one that just passed in the United States, there are a lot of reporting requirements for all of these agencies on how to make their licensing schemes better. And the idea behind this is that we need to have a better licensing scheme, because right now in the United States, there's no on-orbit jurisdiction, right? The
Hmm.
FAA has you licensed for launch and it has you licensed for reentry. What you do in between is, they
Your
really
business,
don't.
yeah.
Yeah, they don't have much control over that. And so one of the things they're looking to is extending this on orbit jurisdiction, which I think would open up a space for at least some agency in the federal government to begin to create standards for um, communications over satellites to make sure that cybersecurity issues are dealt with.
Mm. Yeah, I mean that does stand to a lot of reason. I mean it does the new regulation, the new bill that just went through does sort of open up that opportunity for us to take a good hard look at what we're doing with that and start implementing some new stuff.
Yeah, I think it does, and those reporting requirements in the bill are extensive, and
Hmm.
and so I think that there is a thought that from this bill, once all the reports are in, that there may be a major change in the way that the United States licenses and in the words of the space treaty, supervises and or authorizes and continually supervises its space actors.
Right. It's somewhat of an awkward transition. But you brought us pretty cleanly to the big new space bill everyone's talking about. And we can roll back to cybersecurity a little bit near the end because I'm sure we can talk about that forever. But it is kind of the big news, and I feel a little silly if Voices didn't actually speak about it a little bit. But as I said, the big news right now is there's this new space bill, this new commercial space bill that's gone out that's receiving a lot of good talk from everyone. A lot of people are saying that this is a very, very good and important thing. A lot of people are saying that it, quote, lets us claim asteroids now, which is slightly inaccurate. Let's talk a little bit about that, because you, as a space law person, I'm sure you have a lot to say about it too.
Yeah, so I would first, before we get to the controversial part, one of the things that I think should be pointed out about this bill, and that is sort of getting missed, is that there are 4 titles in this bill, and the first 3 titles do all sorts of stuff that sort of revolutionizes the way that the United States is approaching its space activities, essentially, and particularly vis-a-vis commercial actors, right? So Title One is very much about aerospace competitiveness and entrepreneurship. There is a very definite bent on this of supporting a commercial space industry, and we see that as well in Title Two, which is about commercial remote sensing, and then in Title Three as well, which changes the name of the Office of Space Commerce. Or it changes the Office of Space Commercialization to the Office of Space Commerce. And so these 3 acts are very much all in line with this idea of we want a competitive and innovative space industry, commercial space industry. And so these are the legal tools that we're going to use for this, and the reporting requirements that I was just talking about are the tools in which Congress is going to gain information on how to further legislate. And so I would say that those 3 titles are very, very important. But of course, the one that has everybody upset is Title 4. Hold on, I'm going to scroll down so I have the text in front of me here. If you read the news, depending on what you've seen, either the United States is on the verge of going out and mining an asteroid, or they've just passed a bill that's going to cause a huge international disaster, and the sky is falling.
Mm-hmm.
And really, neither of those is particularly correct here. If you've got specific questions, you can ask them. Otherwise, I really can't just ramble on about this.
Oh, no.
How do you want to go about it?
I mean, it sounded like you were about to transition to a sort of a explanation on that point, like you were going to talk a little bit, and that's cool. Like my usual technique for these episodes is sort of to pose something and then just let my guests ramble on until I cut in with something.
Okay.
So by all means,
feel free. Me rambling, because Lord knows I can.
Oh, please, by all means.
So what this does is, or what this bill does, what Title 3 of the bill does is it puts in a clause into Title 51 of the United States Code, and it says the United States citizen engaged in commercial recovery of an asteroid resource or a space resource under this chapter shall be entitled to any asteroid resource or space resource obtained, including to possess, own, transport, use, and sell the asteroid resource or space resource obtained in accordance with the applicable law. And sorry, I don't want to drop off the end of that clause there, including the international obligations of the United States. And so the controversial part of this, and the thing that has the space law community up in arms and very much sort of at each other's throats to some extent, is because in the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 we have Article 2.
Mm-hmm.
And Article 2 says outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. And so the big question for Article 2 is it talking about property? Is it talking about the inability of a state to go and pick up a rock and claim it and leave with it? And this has been a crux of space law since it was written, right? What does it mean? What does the non-appropriation principle mean?
Right. We've had an episode or two looking at the Outer Space Treaty, and the question about what exactly that section of it means has come up more than once.
Yeah, I mean, and it's ambiguous. And my personal take is that if you think about this treaty, and this is how I think about this treaty, and I would encourage all your listeners to think about it this way: the Outer Space Treaty is a security treaty. The Outer Space Treaty is very much about securing relations between nations in space, and even more specifically, about normalizing the relations between the United States and the USSR at the time of drafting. And to that extent, Article 2 can be read from either a socialist perspective, in which case, yeah, what the United States has done here is wrong, or it can be read from a capitalist perspective, in which case, really, Article 2 doesn't say you can't do this, and in fact, to some extent, Article 1, with the idea of the use and exploration of outer space, it really does take on the idea that you can do this. And I think the best way to think about it is the idea that Article 2, if this is a security treaty, Article 2 is about territory.
Mm.
It's about making sure that states stay within their borders, and it's about making sure that states don't run off and start a war because they're both trying to claim Mars or the moon. I mean, one of the thought experiments that I often pose to my students is, if we didn't have Article 2, would we have gone to Mars by now? For no other reason than to claim it before anybody else could. And so I think that one of the problems that we have with Article 2 is that we're taking this territorial issue that Article 2 is trying to figure out, and we're applying it to property. And we're applying it to property through this the phrase or by any other means, right? If the United States says that somebody can go and take a rock, have they now appropriated that? And what the U.S. Act attempts to do, and I think it does this very artfully, is it says, look, the use of this stuff is okay. You can go get a rock. And we have state practice. The United States obviously has been to the moon, and we brought back rocks. But the next section of this is a disclaimer, and it says it is the sense of Congress that the enactment of this act, the United States does not thereby assert sovereignty or sovereign or exclusive rights or jurisdiction over the ownership of any celestial body. And I think that is really important, right? Sovereignty is way different than the use of a space resource. And this interpretation, and this is what the United States has done here. They've interpreted Article 2. I think this interpretation flows very much within the bounds of Article 2. Article 2, if we're to interpret it that you can't go up there and take a resource, or you can't get a rock, then the idea of use or the idea of use or exploration gets undercut. And we would have to ask the question, do we think that the international community, when they were working on the Outer Space Treaty, really meant to preclude any actors from going up there and using space in this manner? And I think that that's a long shot, right? I think that if you asked anybody that's negotiating that treaty, do you think that this means that people can't go and use resources in space? They'd say no, use and exploration. The real question is the commercial use here.
Right.
Because to some extent, the United States is recognizing a property right. And I think that what this does really is it opens up for the international community the discourse on this, right? This is a point at which, other states can either agree or disagree. And
right.
Hypothetically, if they all disagree, the United States becomes an outlier. In all likelihood, a lot of states are going to agree, and in particular, spacefaring nations. I can't imagine a world in which China comes out in a hard line against this. China would be very interested in going up and getting some resources. I think Russia's on the same lines there. I think ESA probably as well, although particular states within ESA may have issues with it.
I mean, in many ways, like a lot of law and policy and bills, this really comes down to how, like you say, an international stage is going to interpret this and how they're going to react to it. It's all fine and well that we've got this down and now it's been signed into law, but how other states and how other nations respond is really going to be the crux of how this thing goes forward. I mean, I think I saw something when I was browsing a forum about this where someone was posing some thought experiments that the bill had made them think of about how, say, what the reaction is if a Chinese company claims an asteroid that a U.S. company has already claimed, or a government tries to do exploration or scientific projects on an asteroid that, say, Bigelow or whatever has already laid claim to. And they were sort of hashing out these scenarios and trying to discuss them and see where they would go and what have you. But the key thing about most of this discussion is that, we don't really know what China wants to do just yet. And so what that ends up evolving into is really going to be the most interesting part of it to me. The U.S. putting forward a bill that says that, well, depending on who you ask, says that, private citizens can lay claim to asteroids and use those resources and exploit them. That's all well and good, but like I'm saying, the international stage is really the section of this that becomes interesting to me.
I think, well, I'm trained as an international lawyer, so I would agree with you. I think the international section of it is where the interest comes from, and because one of my things, and I tend to be very skeptical of a lot of the commercial models that get put forward.
Right.
I'm still not terribly convinced that going and getting an asteroid and mining it for stuff and trying to bring that back to Earth is really going to be something that ends up being economically feasible.
Certainly not yet.
Not yet.
Not anywhere
yet.
soon.
And then the other answer that people often give is the on-orbit manufacturing. And I when you begin to talk about smelting metal on orbit, I kind of glaze over and forget that you're talking. Maybe that's just me. But sorry, I've lost my train of thought now.
You've also lost all of our listeners. So
yeah,
congratulations.
I know. I'm one of those people. I love space. I don't believe. I just try not to drink the Kool-Aid too often.
I mean, I think that a lot of people would agree with you, honestly. I mean, a lot of this show does, in many ways, aim to break down some of the misconceptions and commonly held sacred cows of space settlement. And I think one of the ones that we go after often is this idea that space manufacturing is something that is an economically viable project, and I don't think that it is either, and I don't think most of our guests would agree that it is. I don't think there's any products that we can make easier and cheaper in space that we don't already make, either in China or wherever it is that the manufacturing currently is happening on a big scale.
Right. I mean, and if you're talking in terms of settlement, right? At some point, if settlement happens, those types of capabilities will be needed. But like, if you pick up a book that's talking about the space economy from the early '80s, all it is space manufacturing.
They're big on products being made in space without
Right.
really specifying what those products are supposed to be. One element that I really like, if you pick up a book from the '80s, is that they often talk about food shortages and population crises.
Yeah.
Somewhat of a solved problem in our current state, at least for the next
Mhm.
couple decades. We sort of fixed that with GMOs and what have you, but it makes me wonder what else was going on in the 1980s that I'm not aware of, that apparently manufacturing was in need of a new place to do so. Anyway, we went on a little bit of a tangent, as we were saying before.
But at the international level, and this is a paper that I'm working on right now, and that I hope to have out to somewhere soon, is that the way that we're likely going to see movement on this issue at the international community, and this is totally my prediction, right, is that we're going to see this in terms of coordination. We're not going to have a huge international fight over whether or not this particular clause violates Article 2. I don't think that's the way this is going to play out. The way this is more likely to play out is those examples that you were talking about, right? Let's say that Planetary Resources has gone up and they say, this is our asteroid. And a company from anywhere else in the world, Andorra is the one that I used to always use in class. The Andorra launches something up there, and it's going for the same asteroid. How do we figure that out, right? Because does Planetary Resources have a right to be there by virtue of the U.S. law, and to what extent can that U.S. law bind this company from Andorra to keep them from doing this? And I think that what you're going to see is, instead of states trying to deal with this very sticky issue of sovereignty and territory, which is like at the very center and crux of the international community, right? When you mess with sovereignty and territory, you're changing an entire governance system, and they don't want to do that. And it's going to look more in terms of something like the ITU or the deep sea bed regime, or even maybe just something like the Hague Code of Conduct for ballistic missile launches. And
Right.
those are all like different levels of regimes which could control this.
In many ways, that scenario that you list out there is understandable why people might get either concerned or upset about. Say, I saw someone mention it as the U.S. claiming ownership to the stars, which is really, really ridiculously overblown. But you can kind of see where that sort of sentiment comes from. You know, I mean, if the U.S. is the one that has all of the policy already written down for it, you can kind of see how someone might look at that and think, uh-oh, you know, what about smaller nations that want to attempt something like this? Or what about other countries or other groups? Have we just handed the keys to private corporations, which already a lot of people are concerned about, you know, with their actions in space and what they're planning to do in space. But I think you're right. I mean, in a lot of ways, space has always been a place of mutual cooperation between nations, despite, you know, the space race and what have you. And a lot of people have already suggested that space and space development is a great place where we see multiple nations who are often on shaky ground working together and coming up with solutions to problems that we see up there. And in international law, that's also a place where we often see that. We often see nations coming together to hash out exactly how we're going to deal with these sticky situations and these, you know, issues that may or may not arise, because frankly, it's a lot easier to sit down with someone and go, hey, okay, how are we going to do this, than have a massive international incident where God only knows what ends up happening. So I think you're right. I think one of the early episodes we had, one of our guests suggested that there is an inevitable need for a international body that governs space activity, such as, you know, resource gathering and stuff. An inevitable, it's just something that we'll end up needing if we continue down this space expansion path. And I wonder if the international response to this bill won't be the first steps towards something like that. You know, I mean, it's a little far-fetched perhaps, but it's an interesting thought.
I've heard this has actually been something that's been out there for a while, right? Mm-hmm. This idea that we should have an international community, and it first really came up, or international control of some sort, and it first really, I think, came up in terms of space traffic management, right? The idea of, we've got all this stuff up there, we really only have one orbit that has any control over who's up there, and you know, that system has its ups and downs, but there's only one orbit that has that, and so there is a need for a body to somehow coordinate this. And I think that I'm sure my chuckle came through there. Is that one of when this, it always gets posed almost as a UN type body, right? Mm-hmm. A body that is going to come in and tell people what they can and cannot do in space. And I think that one of the problems with that is that really turns off a lot of countries, or a lot of people. And I mean, you know, you go into the United States Congress, or you go into Parliament or whatever it is in Russia, and in the same, you know, in China, and you say that we're going to form this international body, and it's going to tell you what you can and cannot do in space, and you've immediately lost them as signatories to that body, and they're going to continue doing what they're going to do. But the core idea of this, I think, is really important, and it's this idea that space has traditionally been a place of cooperation. It's an affirmative obligation for states to engage in international cooperation in space. We see space consistently used for diplomatic purposes, and I think that space was extraordinarily important in the Cold War with bringing about better relations between the United States and the USSR. I mean, if we think about, you know, the what we got out of the space race, we have. I love the Soyuz Apollo mission in the 70s, where we docked with a Russian craft, and we allowed our scientists to speak and talk and understand each other in order to pull off a very complex on-orbit procedure.
I mean, in a very real way, the space race is what we got instead of a real war in a
Yeah,
lot of ways.
exactly. Oh, very much so. And I think that it opened up channels during the Cold War for communication between science communities within different states. And I think that was a very, very valuable thing. And aftermath of the Cold War, we end up with the International Space Station, which is another just I think an amazing accomplishment.
And I mean, just the
for
name right there tells you
Yeah.
exactly how how that ties into what we're talking about, the International Space Station.
Exactly, and I think that those sorts of missions are the things that I think that we need to remember exist, right? And states are very much interested in making sure that their own operations are secure, and they're interested in making sure that their individuals and their property that's on orbit are secure. And so there's a need for coordination at the international level. I don't think we're going to see, stakeholders get together and say we need a UN space committee to regulate this. But I could see something in terms of an information sharing regime, right? To a large extent, what the ITU does is not really tell people what orbits they can get into. It simply coordinates who's in what orbit at any given time. And so there's a master register where you can go and look and you can see what's going on. And I think that those sorts of bodies, I don't think they're going to flow out of the resources argument. I think they're going to flow out of increasing congestion in orbit. But that's going to be the sort of thing that I think in the future will be able to say, well, look, they're already on this asteroid and they need this amount of space in order to operate safely. You can't go there. They have priority. And right. So it's a coordinating as opposed to a regulating function. And I think that that's something that's reasonable, probably is needed. And I think that it's something that will come in the future. I don't know if I'd say it's inevitable though.
Okay. I think that's pretty much what we got time for today. We might have run over a little bit because you folks at home won't know this, but we've had a lot of technical issues this episode. Hopefully you won't know it anyway. So
if I repeat myself, it's just a glitch in the system.
Exactly. If there's one or two moments where I'm just sort of muttering under my breath and you hear shuffling papers, who knows what happened? No one in the world could. PJ, is there anything else you'd like to go over before we cut out? Is there any projects you're working on or any places you want people to go to and check out some of your work maybe?
I have an SSRN page, the Social Science Research Network, and that's where you can find pretty much all of my research. So it's at SSRN, and if you Google my name, I also have a web page. It's space.blountsfolly.com. I will say that I've been largely negligent in updating it this semester, but hope to be back on it soon. So if they want to check that out, and I'm on Twitter as @BlountsFolly, so you can find me there.
Brilliant. I'll leave links to all that in the description, and you guys should go check it all out. Especially follow him on Twitter, because we like sending people your way.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, PJ. It was a really great talk. You're definitely going on the list of people we want to speak to again, because I feel like I've cut you off in the middle of something there, and you could just go on for another 50 minutes for us, and I'd really like to let you do that.
Well, I'd be happy to come back anytime.
Brilliant. See you soon.
All right, thanks.
Hey folks, thanks for listening to Voices from L5. A couple things before we go. I want to say a big thank you to John Boswell, who makes Symphony of Science. That's the music that's playing right now and the music that plays right at the beginning. Check him out at YouTube under Melody Sheep. Secondly, I want to say a huge thank you to all of our Patreons, but especially Nick LaCrome, our current $10 Patreon. Without you guys, the show wouldn't really be going anywhere. And biggest news of all, of course, is that this microphone that you're currently hearing me from is courtesy of our Patreon donators. So thank you very much again. If you guys are interested in becoming Patreon donators, check out my Patreon. That's patreon.com/voicesfroml5. We got some really fantastic goals and some really great stuff we want to do with the show in the future that we need a little bit of support to get there. Check it out. As little as $1 a month really does make a difference. If you guys want to support the show in a different way, feel free to like, share, subscribe, link this show around a little bit, tell your friends, and vote 5 wherever you might be listening to us. It really helps to get the word out that way. Lastly, I do want to say if you guys have any interest or feedback or anything you just want to talk to me about, feel free to email me at voicesfroml5@gmail.com. I check it all the time, and I'm always on the lookout for new guests or show ideas. Thanks, guys.